Shalom Aleichem, and seid herzlich begrüßt. Good evening and welcome. My name is Sebastian Schulman, and I am the Director of Special Projects and Partnerships here at the Yiddish Book Center. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to the Yiddish Book Center's virtual theater for a very special program about Frume Halpern's Blessed Hands, a new translation by Yermiyahu Ahron Taub that is being presented as part of the Yiddish Book Center's Great Jewish Books Club. And we are very lucky and very excited to have Yermiyahu with us tonight. Before we get started, please note that your video and audio will be off throughout the program, although you may send questions through the question panel. Please keep those short and please refrain from sending comments as we try to get to as many questions as possible. Following the presentation that Yermiyahu will be sharing with us, please continue to stay online for a small group discussion facilitated by myself and other Book Center staff as part of the Great Jewish Books Club. For those discussions, a link will be posted in the chat here that will lead you to a new Zoom room. You can click on that link or paste it into your browser. If you click on the link, a red button may show up that will ask you to leave this room and join another. We'll remind you about that later on tonight. In the meantime, it is my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Yermiyahu Ahron Taub, who is an author, and a literary translator, and a poet. He has published 6 books of poetry that are in Yiddish and in English, and sometimes somewhere in between. Wonderful poetry, and this includes books such as Die Bildung von geln Narcissus, Prozelid, The Education of a Daffodil, Prose Poems, a moyz, tsvishn volkndike volkn-krat, libene Yidishe Lieder, a Mouse Among Tottering Skyscrapers, Selected Yiddish Poems, Tfiles finden apikoyres, Prayers of a Heretic, Uncle Feygele, was shtilka hat beleuchten, what stillness illuminated, and the Insa-tiable Psalm. A CD of 9 of Taub's Yiddish poems was set to music, entitled Sie greitendig sich zum Tanzen, Neue Yidische Lieder, Preparing to Dance, New Yiddish Songs, and that was released in 2014. He has been honored in many different ways and by many different institutions. I'll mention just a few of those. He was honored by the Museum of Jewish Heritage as one of the best emerging Jewish artists. He has been nominated 4 times for a Pushcart Prize and twice for the Best of the Net Award. And perhaps most importantly, at the Yiddish Book Center, he is also an alum of our Translation Fellowship Program. Yermiyahu, I would love to welcome you to the stage. Get uvend.
Thank you so much, Seb. Thank you to the Yiddish Book Center for having me. Thank you all for coming and listening. There are many people to thank. A translation is a collective enterprise, and my acknowledgments are very long in the book, so hopefully you'll get to see them at some point. I am now going to share screen. Say, can everybody see? Okay. Well, I assume if you can't, someone will let me know. It's like I can't see anybody. Okay. So good evening again. Today I'm going to be talking about the Yiddish writer Frume Halpern, as you know, who I'm calling a Yiddish literary voice for the marginalized. Her book, Gebenchte Hand, der Erzählungen, which is the book I translated, pictured on screen on your right and in my hands here, a rather austere green book, was published by Eco Verlag in 1963. It has 39 stories. There's a foreword by Yitzchak Runch, and a brief note by the author, actually, in my opinion, like too brief. I wanted more, but there it is. A listing of supporters who help bring about the book. And to me, this is something always interesting about Yiddish literature and Yiddish books in particular, as someone who's a book person and interested, a bibliophile, what does a Yiddish book look like? How is it different from, books in other languages? And it often has, right, a list of supporters. There's a committee. There's a vice president. It's really, I love that granularity that is in a Yiddish book of who helped make this book happen. And that's not something one always sees in other languages or possibly even often. So Yiddish truly was a communal, Yiddish literature was a communal enterprise. People wanted this book to come out, and you couldn't always rely on publishers to have that budget. It was Frume Halpern's only book, and she acknowledges the fact that it was even brought out was due to her advocates and supporters who, I'm paraphrasing here, but basically rescued it from the yellowing pages of newspapers. And if not for their work, we wouldn't be here tonight. So I came up with several themes that kind of unify the book. There are stories with disabled characters. Here you can see some of them. I think all of them are sort of, deeply affecting, filled with touches of, irony, sorrow. One of my favorites was The Mute Mother, which is about a mute mother who becomes pregnant under a mute girl, really, at that point, young woman, who becomes pregnant, much to the shock of all the people in her courtyard who had kind of acted as a protector of her. And they were all distraught that this had happened. And the story traces her relationship with her son and the other neighbors, and comes to a rather devastating conclusion. There's a book about two blind people fall in love, which is another sort of haunting story. The backstories are really richly developed, and I think one of Halpern's strengths was to imagine worlds that weren't her own, sensory worlds of the senses or lack of senses, deprivation of senses, and to, fully enter that universe. What was it like to be blind? What was it like to not be able to move or not have movement of the legs? There are stories set in or adjacent to hospitals, which may or may not have been connected to her work as a massage therapist. In the Garden of Eden, which is a story towards the beginning of the collection where Blazer kind of floats, kind of hovers between life and death in a hospital. And there's some incredible sentences in there about him sort of reaching for limbs that are kind of floating out there. It's this kind of mind expanding sort of cosmic story about floating between two worlds, really. In The Punishment, the nurse, I think her name, Nurse Miss Murray, I believe her name was, is basically a racist, someone who has racist beliefs and acts on those beliefs, racist and anti-Jewish. And Halpern goes really deeply into her psyche and into how the trajectory of her life. So Frume Halpern didn't shy away from the dark side. She didn't only present sort of noble and heroic figures. And I think that's a sign of her writerly courage. There are stories with African American protagonists. The Last Breakfast was particularly powerful to me. It's a story about lynching and about the South. And it's a story in which those two, the lynching and the South, are never mentioned, but we know what it means. She was really a master of restraint and economy. One of the most moving to me was Rusty, My Friend, which is a kind of meditation on aging and lost love. The protagonist speaks to a dog and finds parallels in the dog's situation and his or her own. An Orphan Synagogue is about a young Orthodox rabbi struggling to keep a synagogue going. And I think that's a theme that's sort of familiar to me, is the struggles of keeping a synagogue going. There are stories about the aftermath of the Holocaust, right? So Halpern was of that generation. Most of these stories came out in the 40s and 50s. The book came out, as I said, in 1963. And these are stories that grapple with the aftermath of the Holocaust from that early, I'm not going to say immediate, but close to immediate perspective, not by someone who had been there, but by someone who encountered survivors and wrote about them, knew people who didn't survive, such as in Blume, which is a beautiful letter to, in the form of kind of a tone poem to a friend. These are the stories that I thought worthy of consideration for the Jewish short story canon. So for any of you canon gatekeepers out there, I hope you'll consider them. And every day they change. So these are the ones that are some favorites today. Another day there might be some others. I say I didn't put Gray Lives in here, which is about a newspaper kiosk vendor, and really about her erotic life, her interior erotic life, which is kind of dazzling. Comrade Basha is about a young woman who is considered plain, who comes into political awakening. But even at the end of the story, there's kind of an ambiguity there. She doesn't suddenly have a boyfriend, or she's not mobbed by the movement. She's looking at the mirror. So it's a really powerful story. There's so many others, but these are some of the ones I love. I don't have time to go into all the plot lines. Susan Flesher is particularly notable. It's about the encounter of childhood friends many years later as adults of a former theater actor, and the son of a beer magnate, I believe. And their awkward, fraught, tense, almost tug of war of an encounter. It's really extraordinary. We've already talked about The Last Breakfast. By My Mother's Sickbed is almost an experimental work about memory and about history, about place in history. So there's a lot there. Just some remarks about Frume Halpern's writing. They're filled with psychological insight. There's a lot of back and forth. They're case studies or portraits. When I recently saw, I was recently at a museum where there was a portrait by Alice Neal, and the plaque talked about Alice Neal's, collection of souls, and that kind of made me think of Frume Halpern too. They really are like soul portraits, right? Another artist that made me, that I formed a sort of mental connection with in terms of Frume Halpern was Kata Kollwitz. And there was an exhibit in New York, I believe at MoMA, yes, which was pretty great. So I don't know if it's still up, but if you're there, definitely some connections between Kata Kollwitz and Frume Halpern. We've talked already about the empathy and compassion, about lives on the margins, what that means, about the complexity of that, right? The insistence upon dignity, the search for meaning, the search for connection, the refusal to just surrender. One reader who wrote to me said these are stories about the proud poor, which I thought was quite interesting. My friend Ella. We talked about the poetic prose. Um, there's a lot about nature and her connection, from Halpern's connection with the natural world. And there's also little streaks of humor, usually directed at those at the upper echelons, shall we say. A little bit of biographical. This is a photo of Frume and Isa before immigration to the United States from Bialystok. This is the ship's manifest that she was on, the Princess Alice. It sailed from Bremen, 1904, and arrived in New York. She's listed as 22, female and single. There's always a lot of uncertainty around official documents, even though they're official documents. I mean, she was clearly with Isak before, but they may not have been married. And actually, one family member wasn't even sure they got married at all, although she is listed as his wife later on, as we'll see. Her race is Hebrew, and she's going to stay with this cousin. This is Isaac's certificate of naturalization, and there's a ton of information on it. And so he was born in 1881. His wife is Fanny, and then the two children, Nora and Vera, are listed. And I love this. I'm not an anarchist nor a believer in the practice of polygamy, and it is my intention in good faith to become a citizen of the United States of America, and to permanently reside thereof, so help me God. So according to family lore, Fruma did receive formal nursing training in the old country, but she couldn't practice here in the US due to the additional training needed and the language barrier. And she transitioned into massage therapy. And this is a family tree that the family sent me of kind of the later generations. My main contacts were Victor and Judith, and Robert, and they are all children's of Nora and Harry. And here's Nora and Vera, Yetta, circa 1912. And here they are much later. And this is from with her great-grandson Gregory. And actually, when I first contacted the family, I left a message, and that was Lisa, Gregory's wife's voicemail. Because I didn't know if I had the right family. So adventures in genealogy, which is always fun. This is a family Hanukkah menorah that I believe Fruma brought over, possibly, from our Isak brought over, but it's definitely passed down within the family. A little bit about Fruma and her milieu. She was a member of a literary fraternal club in the Bronx. She's talked about as being deeply affected by events. There's an article by a fisherman where she's described as a gentle soul, generous, sensitive, and shy. And when her club wanted to devote an evening to her writings, she objected. But the event took place anyway. And that article was translated by Nora Lynn, Fruma's daughter, and Emmanuel Klein. So Nora knew Yiddish, and that's something interesting as well, right? Because often the children of Yiddish writers don't. I don't know if Vera did, but I'm assuming she did. So Fruma's work was supported by the Morgan Freiheit, the communist affiliated, or people say leftist communist, and it appeared there, and in the Sammlungen, the kind of associated literary zine supplement. Her book was reviewed. The headline was "Quiet Stories About Ordinary People." The reviewer Avram Bick noted, Frume Halpern is a quiet writer storyteller. She does not chase after the big tangled themes. Her people are ordinary and modest, and they struggle with their fate and don't make much big tragedies or dramas out of their life problems. He noted that as the quiet in her stories, so quiet that every gesture and movement of a character has an echo, which I thought was lovely. Here is Yitzhak Runch, and he wrote the foreword. He's an advocate. He was part of the Prolet Pen group. He was active in the committee. He might even have been the chair to put out Gebenchte Hand. And here's this photo courtesy of his son. There's a lot to discover about this milieu, this sort of communist world. And Yitzhak Runch was like a key figure in it. He was really prolific. Itche Goldberg was another key figure, editor of Yiddish Kultur. On a side note, we met him when I was in the summer program at YIVO in Colombia years and years ago. He came by to speak to us, the students in the program, and he was also an advocate. And in my afterword, I talk about precisely how they advocated for her writing. Here's the gravestone of Frume with photos courtesy of Cecile, and you can see the dates. The date of birth is 1885. There was some back and forth in the documents, but it's certainly in that range of 1885, around there. The memorial meeting is in honor of Frume. It was held in 1966. Here are some of the speakers. Bella Goldworth was herself a writer, translated by Max Rosenfeld. So yes, so I just find it so interesting to see which names are going to show up in these documents. And that's it for me. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop share.
Shenem Dung, thank you very much, Yermiyahu. We'll take a few minutes here for any questions. I have a couple myself, and then we'll head into another Zoom space for a more intimate conversation with everybody who would like to stay. But before we get there, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about your encounter with Frume Halpern as a translator. What were the challenges you had in rendering her work into English? You talked a lot about the particularities of her voice, this very quiet, economical way of writing. How did you render that into English? What posed particular challenges or questions for you as a translator?
Well, in the obvious note, there was the question of rendering African American versus Negro, because there are a lot of stories with African American protagonists. So I kind of, I went back and forth on a lot of this. Basically, I mean, the book came out on the cusp of that transition from Negro to Black. It was kind of pre-African American. So, I did some reading of articles about that. Technically, I mean, I go through this at great length in the book. Technically, to be truly historically accurate, I might have better used Negro. But in the end, I decided to go with Black, in the spirit of Frume Halpern's work, which, is clearly located in the anti-racist tradition, right? Like not even clearly, like explicitly, is located in that tradition. So in that spirit, I went with Black. There are some things, looking back that I might have changed. Like I wrote, Black people, but I wrote Jews. So instead of Jewish people. So, these are always things you have to weigh, one has to weigh as a translator, like, in the spirit of inclusivity and appropriate language, but also trying to enter the spirit of the book and not feel so like weighted down by all these, correct terms, just because sometimes that can detract as well. So it's that interplay. between those questions and those challenges that, kind of appear throughout the book. There are always questions about tone um, and register that were key. Because some of the protagonists are more educated, some are less. And so that's always tricky. Um, and yet like the book is like very rigorously literary.
Mm.
So, balancing all that. I mean, from herself, there are multiple references to Yiddish literature. She was clearly influenced by, in that she saw herself as in that tradition, and the stories contain references to Yiddish literature. But also she was concerned about bringing the non-Yiddish world out to a Yiddish speaking audience. So I would say, yeah, tone, register. I think my natural tendency is towards the high.
Mm.
So I have to scale that back sometimes. So yeah, those were some of the questions, concerns that I wrestled with.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
I will add, for anybody who hasn't yet read the book, you do a wonderful job of really explaining how you have grappled with many of these issues in after your translation. But there's sort of an apparatus around the literature itself. So for those looking for a deeper dive, you provide some of that within the book
And
itself.
even that is always the question, like how much do you provide or how much, that's something about being a Jewish writer in general. It's like how extensive should the glossary be? Because you don't want it to be too much, but on the other hand, you don't always want people can just look things up, but then it's taking them out of their reader's experience, the readerly experience.
Right.
So yeah, that's just a question. I always feel like I try to do, try to find that happy middle where it's just enough, but not like too much. And my publisher here was really good about saying,
Mm.
well, this might have been known for, Halpern's readers at the time, but it will not be known um, for English language readers. There are things that like so steeped in this, I sometimes assume that people will know things and they don't. Yeah. But on the other hand, you don't always want to be explaining. So yeah.
Well, I
There's,
find.
translators talk all the time about the internal gloss,
Mhm.
where you sort of have the explanation like in the text as opposed to a footnote or an endnote. Um, but sometimes that can be clunky too. So yeah, challenges.
Well, I
All
think
good.
this is the heart and the fun, I think, of being a translator, what makes it difficult and interesting. And I think you've done a wonderful job in this book of achieving that balance. And I hope the readers in the room agree. I'm going to try to collect a few of the questions we have in the chat because there's some themes that repeat. I'm wondering if you could talk about how you found the work of Frume Halpern to begin with. She's not, you're arguing to put her in the canon, and some of our attendees might have heard of her before, but I would gather that many people have not heard of her until you brought her to our attention. So, how did you first hear about her work, and what drew you to translate it?
Right. So I'm somebody who like follows footnotes and reads lexicons, and if there's a writer I haven't heard of that I see in some announcement, or I'll start like tracking that person down and seeing what I can find. I saw from us um four of her stories have been previously translated, at least four, possibly more. And three were in Arguing with the Storm, edited by Ria Tregelbov, and one by Joachim Neuberschel in one of his Norton anthologies. And so I was like, who is this person? I haven't heard of them. And then, yeah, one thing led to another. I just started following up on that. And then, I think the stories really, hit home for me, especially the ones about hospitals and the illness, as we age and our bodies kind of decline. I I've never quite seen a text like this that so interweaves, questions of illness, questions of death with all these other sorts of characters where it becomes part, like a key part, but a part of a broader conversation. And that was endlessly fascinating. I was struck by her incredible empathy, her ability to connect the mind and the body, and to think about the effect of trauma on the body, right? And on sort of layers of trauma, right? Kind of excavating trauma from deep within the body, right? Even the first story really gets into that. Um, I was struck by her um, trying on different voices, her kind of empathy of tone, her playing with character, her ability to use the short story to kind of push the short story, so that it's sometimes not even a story, but more like a prose poem, especially the ones where, she's just talking to people, like Bluma, like by my mother's sickbed, and even in Blessed Hands, it's not really well, the end, it gets into a story, but like that beginning where it's like the hands and the layers and how trauma accumulates under capitalism, like among different classes. Um, those were all things that stuck with me. And then, during the pandemic, I really made the decision to go with it as we were all like, in various stages of lockdown and trying to like grapple with, what is happening. Yeah. Um, I just felt like she has a lot to say. I think Clara and Mary, the story about the two girls starving themselves, really stuck with me. A lot of them stuck with me. Yeah. So that's always a good sign. Like when years after reading, the text sticks with you and you go back to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And
Thanks for that question.
and I can definitely see, knowing your poetry, how your poetic voice was drawn to hers. I didn't think that until you sort of pointed out the poetry in her own work.
That's
But I
something I
definitely
always,
see.
yeah, yeah. Sorry, no, finish your thought.
Oh, that's it.
Yeah.
I just could see that parallel, or that conversation. Uh,
Yeah. I mean, that's something I have to have that emotional connection with the writer, and I have to feel like I can get at that voice. There's
mm,
some that whose work I greatly admire, but I'm not always sure I'm the right translator for it. So yeah, but I definitely felt like that connection um with Frume Halpern. Yeah,
Beautiful, beautiful. We unfortunately don't have time for more questions in this space, but I invite folks to stay. And Yermiyahu, I would love it if you could join us in the next room
sure.
as well. Before we leave this space, I was wondering if you might read for us a little of the
Yes.
Yiddish, and a little of the book, and if you might comment about, if somebody is a beginner or an intermediate student of Yiddish, or they're not a regular reader, but they know Yiddish. Um, is her Yiddish accessible in the original?
I think so. Yeah. But we can talk about that. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
So I'll
excellent. So
start. Yeah, go ahead.
please,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
just inviting you to read, and
Okay.
then I will explain how the next part of our program will work thereafter.
Okay. So I'll start with the English, and then go to the Yiddish. And that's something that Irena Klefish suggested that I do when I was on a panel like, 100 years ago with her. That way, readers who may not know Yiddish as well, once they've heard the English, can connect those words and to the Yiddish. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first page of Blessed Hands. Ever since Zara stood up on her own 2 feet and became an independent person, her hands had been in constant contact with human bodies. Her fingers caress their aches and nurturance, fusing with the pain that comes from hard labor. The hands receive thanks and blessings from all sorts of mouths and in all sorts of languages. Sometimes they were blessed with tears and sometimes with a smile. Sarah didn't take pride in how her hands looked, unless she was working with them. Outside of her work, she maintained, they were nothing to flaunt. Her hands weren't feminine enough. Heavy muscles, taut veins, wrinkled skin, broad palms. In other words, hands without any charm whatsoever. But when the hands came into contact with the human body, they were animated with a life of their own. They appeared tender and soulful with a maternal devotion, with the will to lighten aches and alleviate suffering, with a drive to care for children and elders. The hands extended not just to the ailing organs, but all the way to the human soul. Through her two unlovely but effective hands, Sarah also connected often with those who didn't understand her language and couldn't make themselves understood to her. Her hands were her medium, and through them, patients felt her closeness down to the deepest depths of their feeling, deep depths of their suffering, ailing limbs. In their eyes, Sarah detected blessings without words. These mute blessings were a form of encouragement to her, a kind of force field. They were the foundation of the love she carried within her throughout these many years for all those who suffered. So there's so much in this text in just these few paragraphs. There's a sense of the hands as excavators of history, layers of trauma, which we've talked about, the hands as sort of archaeological tools in a way. There's a sense of, the question of gender conformity or gender symmetry, or what's the word? Coordination. The question of being feminine or not being feminine, or hands or not being feminine. There's actually a lot of that in this book, which I talk about in another piece that I've written about what does it mean to be a queer reader coming across a text like this, where there are protagonists in various states of comfort and discomfort with their bodies. So yeah, and that's there's also a lot here about speaking and not speaking, and um, connection without language, other kinds of connection through touch, through emotional coming together, all that in just a very few paragraphs. So now I'll just read a paragraph in the Yiddish, just to give you a sense of that. Gebenchte Hand. Sensore hat sich gestellt auf die eigene Fies und ist geworden ein selbstständiger Mensch, seine in ihrer Hand in ständigen Barriere mit menschlichen Körpers, und ihre Finger laschen mit der Kindskeit die menschliche Wehen, verheften sich mit die Wetterchen, was kommen und schwere Ratze. Die Hände werden bedankt und gepencht von allerlei Meile und auf allerlei Scheunes. Einmal bencht man sie mit Tränen in die Augen und einmal mit der Schweichel. Thanks.
Shkoyach, absolutely gorgeous in beide Sprachen. Thank you for bringing Frume Halpern to the English-speaking world and to a world of new readers. It's really a delight always to have you here and to have your translations on our shelves and in our hearts. Shenem dank, Yermiyahu.
Thank you so much.
So this concludes this portion of tonight's program. Before we head off to our new space, I just want to take a moment to thank tonight's producer, Elizabeth Carteropoli, and to remind you that tonight's program is presented as part of an ongoing series of programs brought to you live from the center. And you can see a full schedule of those events and register for them on our website at yiddishbookcenter.org/events. I want to thank all of our members whose support make these programs possible. And if you would like to learn more about how you can join the Yiddish Book Center and support our work, please visit our website at yiddishbookcenter.org/donate.